All right, so get ready because today we are going deep into the case of Ronald Hinton.
Oh yeah, this one's a tough one.
Yeah, he's a name that really shook Chicago back in the late 90s. I know you're really into true crime
Absolutely.
and really want to understand the factors that can lead someone to become a serial killer. And that's what we're going to try to do today.
Let's get into it.
We've got a few sources to help us try to figure this whole thing out. We've got Hinton's Wikipedia article. We've got some Chicago Tribune articles from back in the day covering his arrest and his trial and his sentencing. So yeah, we'll dive into all that, explore his background, look
Yeah.
at the specifics of his crimes, and what makes this case so disturbing, including the role that his own daughter played in the whole thing.
Yeah, that always gets me. The family angle, you know?
So yeah, it's disturbing.
It's not just about the brutality of the crimes themselves, but like trying to understand how someone gets to that point.
Right, right, exactly. Like, so let's start at the very beginning. Ronald Hinton was born in Chicago in 1972, and to put it lightly, his childhood was just horrific.
Yeah, no kidding.
This wasn't just like a rough upbringing, like we're talking documented severe abuse.
Right, right. And the sources paint a very disturbing picture of his mother. She was deeply disturbed, actually believed her children were, get this, tainted by Satan.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, and subjected them to just horrific physical abuse, even like standing on them during beatings, you know?
Oh, this is
It's awful. And the psychological scars from that kind of abuse, they run deep and they can really manifest in some disturbing ways later in life.
yeah, and then to make things even worse, she abandons the family.
Right. Talk about a double whammy of trauma. It's
Unbelievable.
like, yeah, it just amplified whatever feelings of worthlessness or insecurity that were already there from the abuse. We see this lack of secure attachment all the time in the histories of violent offenders.
Yeah, yeah.
It's like that foundation for healthy emotional development was just never there.
And it seems like he never really found stable ground after that. He struggled with drug addiction, which spiraled totally out of control after the death of his son.
And that's a key point. Hinton was a father himself before all of this happened.
Wow.
He had a daughter, which really adds another layer of complexity to the whole thing, trying to understand his motivations, and the impact of his actions.
It's so hard to try to reconcile the image of a father with the brutality of his crimes. And before the murders, his criminal record shows a clear escalation of violence. We're talking multiple convictions for robbery, showing a real disregard for the law and willingness to use force.
Exactly. And these offenses, these were red flags that unfortunately didn't seem to trigger any kind of effective intervention. And then in December 1996, his first known murder happens.
Yeah, Felicia Mullins, just 17 years old. He had a previous sexual relationship with her, was found strangled in her apartment. Her boyfriend made the discovery. Just awful.
Horrible.
Felicia was also a mother of three, having her first child at 14. It really shows just how far the effects of Hinton's actions reached. The devastation goes way beyond just the immediate victims.
Way beyond.
2 years later, in August 1998, Hinton and an accomplice by the name of Michael Sanders committed their second murder. This time, the victim was Kiri Leah Gagne, a 36-year-old woman. She had no connection to Hinton or Sanders at all.
Yeah, this one was a brutal home invasion.
Yeah.
Gagne was raped and strangled in her own bedroom. They stole her belongings, some of which were later found by sanitation workers, just discarded like trash.
It's just chilling. How callous can you be?
Yeah, just a horrifying display of dehumanization. And just a few months later, February 1999, they strike again, this time adding a third accomplice, a guy named David Wales. The victim, Mercedes Faye Ayers, 31 years old, suffers a similar fate: group rape and strangulation.
It's a terrifying pattern, just escalating brutality.
Right, and this third murder, it's ultimately what leads to their capture.
And it's a shocking twist how it happens.
It really is.
After they killed Ayers, they used her bank card, and, security footage of them gets broadcast on local TV.
And get this, Hinton's own daughter, just a third grader at the time, she recognized her father from the footage.
Oh, my God.
Can you imagine that? A child that young having to confront her own father's horrific acts?
It's too awful.
She told her teacher, who immediately contacted the police, and that was the beginning of the end for Hinton and his accomplices.
Wow.
DNA evidence confirmed their guilt in Aries' murder and linked Hinton and Sanders to the other two. It was an open and shut case.
So Wales, the accomplice in the third murder, he was convicted and sentenced to 40 years.
Right.
Sanders received 2 life sentences for his involvement in the second and third murders. And Hinton, facing the possibility of the death penalty, took a plea deal. receiving 3 life sentences without parole. He is currently incarcerated at Hill Correctional Center. But here's where it gets even more complicated. Judge Schreier, the judge who presided over Hinton's case, had also decided to spare another serial killer from the death penalty. A man named Ronald Megan, who had strangled 3 women in Chicago just a few years earlier.
Oh, wow, that's right. Judge Schreier's decisions in both of these cases, they really raise some interesting questions about the death penalty. What factors go into determining such a sentence? It's really fascinating.
Definitely a complex legal and ethical landscape to figure out. We'll dive into that more after a quick break. We were just talking about Judge Schreier's decision to spare both Ronald Hinton and Ronald Macon for the death penalty. What kinds of things could lead a judge to make such a huge decision, especially in cases as horrific as these?
Well, it's a fascinating question from both a legal and ethical standpoint. While the specifics of each case are confidential, we can look at some of the general principles that judges consider when it comes to capital punishment. One major factor is something called mitigating circumstances.
Mitigating circumstances. Can you break that down for us a little?
Sure, sure. So these are basically factors that might lessen a defendant's culpability, even if they don't excuse the crime. In Hinton's case, his history of severe childhood abuse could have been considered, and, potential mental health issues stemming from that trauma.
So even though he committed these terrible acts, the judge took into account the horrific circumstances he came from.
Exactly. It's not about condoning the crime, but it's about recognizing the complexity of the human experience and understanding that even deeply troubled individuals can be capable of rehabilitation.
That makes sense. But what about the argument that the death penalty deters future crimes?
Right. That's a point that's often raised by proponents of capital punishment. But studies on the deterrent effect of the death penalty are really inconclusive. Some research suggests there might be a slight deterrent effect, while others find no significant impact.
So it's not a simple issue then.
No, not at all. It's a very complex debate with strong arguments on both sides. Judge Schreier, in choosing life sentences for both Hinton and Macon, might have been influenced by his own personal views on the death penalty, the specifics of the cases, or even, the potential for rehabilitation in these individuals.
It's a lot to weigh, that's for sure. But let's shift gears for a second and talk about Hinton's daughter. To be so young and have to turn in your own father, I mean, for such horrific crimes, I can't even imagine.
It's heartbreaking. This little girl was thrust into an impossible position, a child forced to confront the absolute darkest aspects of her own family.
Do we know anything about the kind of support she received after she came forward? I mean, talk about trauma.
Unfortunately, the sources we have don't really go into detail about her experience after that moment. But you can imagine a child exposed to that kind of violence and then thrust into the spotlight like that. It's safe to assume she'd need significant psychological support and counseling. The ripple effect of these crimes, it goes way beyond just the immediate victims and their families.
Absolutely. It's a stark reminder that these aren't just stories,
Hmm.
These involve real people, real lives that have been shattered by violence. And speaking of impact, let's talk about the victims' families for a minute.
Right. Their pain and loss are just immeasurable. Felicia
Yeah.
Mullins, Kirilia Gagne, Mercedes Faye Aries. These women were mothers, they were daughters, they were friends, and their absence leaves just this gaping hole in the lives of those who loved them.
It's so important that we remember their stories
Yeah.
and honor their memory. These weren't just statistics or headlines. These were individuals whose lives were brutally cut short.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the sensational aspects of true crime, but we have to remember the human cost. Each of these victims had a life, they had a story, people who loved them. Their loss is profound and deserves our empathy and respect.
Their stories also really highlight the broader societal issue of violence against women. These weren't isolated incidents. They reflect a disturbing pattern that we need to pay attention to and really take action on.
Absolutely. Addressing violence against women requires a multifaceted approach. Challenging societal norms, promoting healthy relationships, providing support for survivors. It's about creating a culture where violence is unacceptable and women feel safe and empowered.
It's a long road, but it's one we have to travel together. Now, let's go back to Hinton's background for a minute. We talked about the abuse he suffered, but were there any other red flags in his past that might have hinted at what was to come?
Well, aside from his escalating criminal record, the sources don't really provide specifics about his behavior or mental state before the murders. However, his descent into drug addiction after the death of his son suggests an inability to cope with loss and trauma in a healthy way.
So it's possible that untreated grief and trauma, combined with his already fragile psychological state, contributed to his violent outbursts.
Yeah, it's a plausible theory, and it really underscores the importance of mental health awareness and access to resources for those struggling with trauma and loss. Early intervention and support can make a huge difference in preventing tragedies like this.
It's just tragic to think that things might have been different if he'd gotten the help he needed. But there's another aspect of this case I want to touch on. The role of Hinton's accomplice, Michael Sanders. What do we know about him and his involvement in all of this?
Well, while the sources focus mainly on Hinton, it's clear that Sanders played a major role in these crimes. He was involved in both the Gagnère and Aries murders, and his presence suggests a level of shared intent and maybe even a disturbing influence on Hinton.
It really makes you wonder, would Hinton have committed these acts alone? Or did Sanders' presence embolden him, escalate the violence?
That's a tough question, and we can't answer it definitively. But research on group dynamics and criminal behavior shows that individuals are more likely to engage in risky or violent behavior when they're surrounded by others who share similar inclinations.
So their partnership, in a way, fueled the darkness inside both of them.
It's a chilling thought, but it's a possibility we can't ignore. It really underscores how important it is to understand the social and psychological factors that contribute to criminal behavior, especially in cases with multiple perpetrators.
This case has so many layers to it. We've talked about Hinton's past, the impact on the victims' families, the complexities of the death penalty, and the role of his accomplice. It's a lot.
It really is. And before we move on, I think it's important to acknowledge that this case brings up some uncomfortable questions about our responsibility as a society. Could we have done more? Were there systemic failures that contributed to this?
Those are questions that we're going to continue to explore as we go into the final part of our deep dive into Ronald Hinton. We've gone over a lot in this deep dive. Hinton's background, the details of his crimes, the impact on the victims and their families, the legal issues, the role of his accomplice. It's a lot.
It really is.
But as we wrap things up here, I keep coming back to this question. Like, what responsibility do we have as a society to try to prevent things like this from happening?
That's the question, isn't it? It's easy to focus on Hinton as this individual, but his story also reflects bigger societal problems, his childhood, the abuse, the addiction, his escalating criminal record, all those were warning signs.
Yeah, like were there missed opportunities? Could better social programs, better access to mental health resources, addiction treatment, could those things have made a difference?
We can't know for sure, but we have to ask those questions. We can't just focus on punishing people after something terrible has already happened. We need to look at the systemic issues that contribute to these cycles of violence and really invest in ways to prevent it.
It's about recognizing that people's actions are affected by their environment, their experiences, and what resources they have available to them.
Right. It's not about excusing what Hinton did, but about understanding all the things that might have led him down this path. And maybe by understanding those factors, we can start to address them and prevent similar tragedies from happening.
It comes back to shared responsibility. We have to create a society that supports those who are most vulnerable, that gives people real opportunities for rehabilitation, and that fosters a culture of empathy and understanding.
And remember, change starts with each of us. We can all advocate for better programs, support those organizations that are helping people with addiction and mental health, and challenge those norms that perpetuate violence.
And speaking of challenging norms, Hinton's daughter is such a powerful example of someone choosing to do the right thing, even though it was incredibly difficult. She could have kept quiet, but she spoke up and maybe prevented more harm.
Her courage is incredible, especially given how young she was and the just unimaginable situation she was in. It shows how resilient people can be, choosing to break the cycle of violence even when it's in their own family.
Yeah, it's a glimmer of hope in such a dark story. And it reminds us that even when faced with something truly awful, there's always the potential for change, for healing.
You just brought up something really important, this idea of redemption. Hinton's crimes are horrible, obviously, but him accepting the plea deal, choosing not to go through a long, drawn-out trial, that could be seen as him taking responsibility.
I never thought of it that way. It doesn't undo the pain he caused, but maybe it shows some remorse, some recognition of what he did.
It's a complicated point, and it really shows the complexity of human nature. We're capable of awful things, but also of admitting our mistakes and wanting to make things right.
So where does this leave us? We've looked at the Ronald Hinton case from all these angles: legal, psychological, societal. We've talked about responsibility, prevention, redemption.
And we've been reminded that true crime isn't just about shocking headlines. It's about real people whose lives are changed by violence. It's about understanding all the things that lead to these tragedies and knowing that we all have a role to play in making a safer world.
This deep dive has been really thought-provoking. We've just scratched the surface of this complex case. But hopefully it's made you want to learn more about these issues and think about how true crime affects us all. Thanks for joining us.